So tonight, I'm thrilled to welcome you to the State of the Global City, Problems and Possibilities, the second of three plenaries taking place during the Urban History Association's Urban History Month, October. This evening's plenary brings together some of the leading voices writing on cities around the world, scholars, historians, and public intellectuals who've been pushing the boundaries of global history from a variety of perspectives, theoretical positions, methodologies, and subject interests. Everyone tonight will talk about the modern 20th and 21st century global city. In their comments, each panelist will offer their thoughts on the state of global cities, both in terms of the state of the literal cities in which countless people in the world reside today, so that we can hear their perspectives on where we are and where we might be headed. But they're also going to talk in terms of the state of the field. We're going to hear their equally important perspectives on where this field of global urban history could, should, and might head as it continues to evolve and grow. It's hard to imagine a more important and pressing topic than the global city. As we wind down the second year of the pandemic, as strikes and economic disruptions ripple across the world, and as social media seems to connect and divide us across time and place in so many different ways. I can't wait for this conversation. Before we begin, please just note that this is being recorded. And just a little bit about the format. Each of our six panelists will share their thoughts on this question of the global city, its problems and possibilities for about 10 minutes. Each of the panelists will introduce themselves and again, will speak for 10 minutes. Once we've heard from everyone, about an hour, we'll transition to Q&A. So put your questions in the Q&A box and try and make them kind of as, inviting for a kind of robust conversation as possible. And I'll try and sort of help think through what will push us along, all right? So starting off tonight will be Cyrus. So Cyrus, go ahead and get us started, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today or tonight. For me, I'm talking from Europe. I need to start by saying that I will really focus on the historiographic sort of issue of issues, problems that are faced, basically the field of urban global urban history today. And I should also say that I come sort of as a historian more from a global perspective, a global historical perspective than an urban historical perspective. I'll make 5 points and I'll try to keep to 10 minutes. We start with point number one. I think one background root of the sort of subfield of global urban history as it has been developing in the last maybe decade is, of course, the entire discussion about world cities or global cities, right? A double term that has been around for much longer. Already back in past decades, a lot of historians talking about basically world or global cities started to see and understand that very often definitions were narrow in the sense that people would look at the economy, maybe sometimes at politics as the key dimension that shapes these sort of cities. So rather maybe sometimes narrow way of looking at things. And I think one of the developments that global urban history has brought about is really a widening of what we are looking at, right? Because we don't really look at simply specific cities anymore in a broader context, but we look at a wide variety of different cities and really phenomena, which I think is a somehow sort of different thing. Now, this widening, I think, is on the one side, very good, but it of course also brings certain issues with itself, right? Definitional issues, the issues of the coherence of the field. This is a problem that the young subdiscipline has been sort of talking about on and off. And one day I was sort of thinking about this widening and the challenge it poses is to think about it through the development more broadly of global history in the last 10, 20 years, right? And one of the clear characteristics of doing global history has been the fact that the global as per se is really difficult to define. People really disagree on what it exactly is, or perhaps put differently, very often they simply use very, very different geographical and spatial reference points when they actually use the term, right? Just give you a couple of examples. The global, just think in terms, for instance, of Sebastian Conrad's, what is global history there? He, unpacks some of these, reference points. Global can stand for, a particular cultural region, a really broad region, past and present, right? It can, in an extreme case, stand for an entire world system, be it economic or else. It can stand sometimes for a particular empire or perhaps multiple empires. It can stand for, a continental sort of, network, and also for instance, sea-based units of analysis when we think about Indian Ocean or Pacific Ocean histories as global histories, as they're very often called. So the global has taken many, many different forms. And that in turn has meant, I think, more specifically for the subfield of global urban history, that also, as I just have mentioned, has taken many, many forms, right? And that, again, on the one side, I think is very salutary and beneficial, but it also, again, poses the issue of the problem of the coherence of the field, right? Do we want, is it important, for us to come to a sort of a common language? Do we need to develop a common sort of set of questions that we then ask the different phenomena that we are basically looking at? This is, of course, very different, just as an aside, to how urban historians working on specific case studies within a national polity sort of that situation. The reason being that give or take, the nation state has certain clear borders. It has a political, territorial, legal sort of unity. And that is a reference point that is much easier to understand, to evoke, to work with than the looser, very often much less former sort of framework that the global gives us as historians, right? That issue of the nation state being much more defined was, of course, a problem too, right? But it was, in a certain sense, it was also an advantage in a certain way, right? Because it made thinking about the particular role of particular cities in a unit easier. So these would be, the first two of my 5 points that I quickly want to go through. A third point will be sort of the question how important relatively to rural phenomena the urban phenomena really is. So one of the really, I think, most important and really interesting developments in the field of history, more generally speaking, perhaps not really the last 10, 20 years, but a little bit earlier, was as a great interest in the history of peasantry, in the history of the rural countryside, also in the modern period, in the 20th century, but also in the pre-modern period, right, before the 19th century. And I sometimes do think that the concentration, particularly on the global urban, makes us in the subdiscipline, perhaps even more than before, a little bit blind to the continued importance of non-urban phenomena also in global history, right? Sure, villages are perhaps less cockpits of particular developments that are global in nature, but in one way or another, sometimes politically, sometimes in terms of economic production, they are extremely important as well. And that, I think, is one challenge that perhaps we may want to think about more going forward, how to integrate thinking about the relationship also to the rural, not simply the hinterland, but the rural as a really important, crucial place of historical developments in the 20th century as well, when we do global urban history. A fourth issue, and I'm sort of slowly getting to the end of my time here. A fourth issue, and that's maybe a little bit related to the third issue I just brought up, concerns the, I think, overall attention, over attention we are still paying to linkages, circuits, networks, using a whole toolbox of terms and images, imaginations that are directly taken from global history. This is very important, of course, and they are, empirically speaking, and to a degree also conceptually speaking, at the heart, I think, of global history, and hence also of global urban history. But at the same point in time, as a good number of global historians have pointed out in the last maybe 5 years, and present political and environmental developments have really helped them along, disconnections and hierarchies are really, really important too. Certain cities lost out in particular, as we all know, right? But they lost out in particular, political, economic developments that have global or multi-continental, sort of, parallels. And I think to think about those disconnections that happen when, for instance, maybe bigger cities, link up with each other, but that basically causes smaller cities maybe to go through hierarchies, declines of particular cities, even if urbanization continues and even actually increases. I think these sort of broad questions need to become more central to the sort of research agenda that we have. So this brings me very quickly to my sort of fifth and last point, and I will end there. And it, in a certain sense, circles back to a point I have made earlier. I do think that we shouldn't shy away from the debate about the field's coherence. And I don't say this in order to say that we need to get to coherence as a subfield. I don't think that the field or the subfield of global urban history needs to become coherent, that there needs to be one single set of questions that drives everybody. I don't think that's possible, not even desirable. But I do think that a sort of a solid discussion about the different ways in which different takes on global urban phenomena actually look like. I think a sort of a comparative discussion of that sort would actually be really important. Simply to keep the broader picture or pictures in mind as we burrow down into our respective empirical case studies. I will end here and hand over very quickly back to Brian. Then I think we'll have a video right now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Cyrus. Next up is Michael Grubel. Michael could not be with us live this evening, so he sent a video to share, and I'll introduce him, and then again, we'll share his remarks. Michael is currently a professor of global history at the Free University of Berlin and is the author of Argentina's Partisan Past, Nationalism and the Politics of History, and a book, Anti-Imperial Metropolitas, Interwar Paris and the Seeds of Third World Nationalism, that won the AHA's, my dog's barking, Jeremy Bentley Prize in World History in 2016. He's also a founding member of the Global Urban History Project. Thank you, Michael, for these remarks.
Ready. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Grubel. I'm delighted to deliver this brief presentation here and video message. And I would like to thank Heather and Thompson for the kind invitation of having me here. And I apologize that I can't be there live, as it is 3 a.m. in the morning in Germany from where I'm talking, as you will be hearing this. So my marching orders were to talk about the state of the global city problems and possibilities. I will mostly focus, however, on historiography and a few remarks about the link between global history and urban history that might stimulate some further discussion. So let me begin with a brief slide and a few comments about this slide. So as a starting point, I think it is important to remark two things about the link between global history and urban history. And the first one is, if you think of global history as one of the main novelties or changes in the field of history at large over the last 30 years, perhaps, and if you think of that change as a product of broader scholarly discussions about globalization, then it is surprising how little sustained attention global historians have paid to cities in history. It is perhaps a bit less surprising, and this refers to this first slide, though no less lamentable, that urban historians, at least until recently, now this is currently changing, have paid relatively little attention to history, to cities outside of the United States and Europe, as you can see with this breakup of the regional focus of articles in the leading urban history journals compared to history journals tout court in the years prior to 2019. So what are the reasons and implications of this, let's say, mismatch or relative lack of communication between the two fields? Now, staying with this slide, I don't think it is the outcome of editorial board policies of urban history journals, which shut out contributions about non-US or European cities. Actually, in many cases, I think the opposite is true, and these journals are now increasingly soliciting such contributions. The problem mostly comes from the other end, and so therefore is because of self-selection. If you study the history of Singapore, many times you will prefer a global history journal or a Southeast Asian history journal as your institutional home over urban history. So why is this, and what are the implications of it? In the last 5 or 6 years, I have been the editor of a blog first called Global Urban History, which then last year morphed into a Cambridge University Press series entitled Elements in Global Urban History. And the experience with both these has been similar in the sense that while it is relatively easy to persuade urban historians to make use of the label global, it is all but impossible to convince global historians to think more systematically about cities. And by this, I do not mean that global historians have neglected cities as sites in which the stories that they tell unfolded. Actually, on the contrary, most of the action of many of these histories took place in cities. The issue is rather that urbanism or cityhood are rarely explicit categories of analysis in their writing. Now, this relative lack of attention to cityhood among global historians is especially striking in comparison to early theorizing about globalization in disciplines other than history. So if you think of Sussan, of Castells, of Harvey, their work has been primarily about the global urban nexus. And so although books on the global history of the 19th century, for example, by Chris Bailey or Jürgen Osterhammel, each have a chapter on cities, I cannot think of an equivalent to Sussan, Castells, or Harvey in history. Again, let me qualify what I mean by this. It is emphatically not the case that global historians have unduly focused on the countryside to the detriment of cities. In fact, if measured against historical rates of urbanization, city dwellers have received a disproportionate amount of attention, which is true probably for history at large, in part because the written historical record produced in and about cities simply tends to be thicker. But in in global history, this urban bias might be even stronger because of the usual things that global historians have been interested in. And so cities as the command and control centers of the world economy, the seats of governments, concentrations of cultural life, and hotbeds of social differentiation have all been integral to global history writing. And the most explicit and obvious tip of that iceberg is the booming interest in port cities in recent years. But below this tip, I think much of this interest has been implicit. Now, if you look at this from the opposite angle, it is also emphatically not the case that there isn't any good urban history about non-European or non-US cities. So for instance, if you take these three books, they are an example of this trend. The problem rather is that these books or authors have mostly found their institutional homes in the regional area studies rather than in urban history. Not because they're systematically excluded from participating in urban history ventures such as the UHA, but again, for reason of self-selection. So I think one of the tasks for the future is how to overcome this. I am not so sure how urban history associations can do so, since from my experience, as I said, the problem rather comes from the opposite side. So the reform has to happen or start there. But I think it's largely an issue of making global historians think more systematically about urbanism and cityhood as an explicit category of analysis in their historical writing. I'll leave it there. My marching orders were that this should be short. So thank you again for your attention, and I wish you all a productive meeting. All right, goodbye.
All right, I believe I'm next, and I'm glad to be following both of those really wonderful talks, although we'll see if mine meshes well or not. Thank you first to the organizers for assembling this panel. I'm actually so delighted to be ending my week in such good company. So thank you all to those of you who are joining as well for sharing your Friday evening like this, or whatever day and time you're in. My name is Nancy Kwok. I'm an urban historian and associate professor at UC San Diego. And I've worked on the expansion of home ownership after 1945 around the world, looking in particular at the role of organizations like the World Bank and the UN, among others. I've also researched a bit on urban informality in the global north, and written about slum clearance and urban renewal in places like Singapore and Manila. Okay, so that was my self-introduction. Just to start with the central task of this group, we're obviously supposed to talk about modern global cities. That's our title, that's our task. And I guess I won't deal with the modern part right now, and I'll try to get to that part in a bit. But when thinking about the question of global cities as a topic, I'd like to start with a question of what this label really identifies. And I remember there used to be a time when you'd go to urban conferences and the word global cities meant that you're going to go to a panel with non-American cities. That's all it meant. But of course, that's not a really particularly helpful way of organizing the majority of the world. So let me try a different approach today. The way I conceptualize global cities, sometimes I prefer to call it global urbanism as a category, is to think of it less as a physical place. And often when you say global cities, the temptation is to think of Saskia Sassen, the juxtaposition of London, New York, Tokyo. But maybe instead we can think of global urbanism as a relationship, a way for urban dwellers to operate in larger circuits of capital, to think about the movement of people and laborers, the negotiation of the world of public opinion and international governance, sometimes that's very weak, I understand, and participation in capitalist industries or FDI-funded projects or other ways of thinking about mobile investment. I would never say global urbanism can only be understood through individual experiences, but certainly we need more understanding of how individuals, groups, and people have made sense of these networks, how they have participated or not in global urbanism, and ultimately how they have coped or refashioned the cities that they live in. So in other words, I would argue that global urbanism is something that people living in cities do, regardless of what hemisphere they sit in. So I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean by this. There's a young mother that I met on one of my research trips to Manila, lives a pretty simple life. She had a government provided house that she paid for in part through a mortgage. And she spent all her time in this house or in the garden outside of it. And at first glance, you might think that her life and who she is pretty unimportant to global urbanism or even to Manilan history. In fact, though, she was only able to pay for that house because her son worked for a construction company in the Middle East. And the house she lived in was modeled after a habitat design that most likely had its roots in some of the global sites and services designs of the 1970s. And because she was able to live in this house and because she could afford it, she had the time and energy to lead a homeowners association, one that the national government used to encourage families, and I use the word encourage very lightly, to leave central Manila and make a life for themselves on the physical periphery of the city where she lived. In this one person's life, we begin to glimpse the complicated circuits and also the historical arc, that longer arc of global urbanism, that on the one hand, she has no choice but to participate in, but that also that she actively did take control of in some fashion, and that did have an impact on the city that she lived in. So for perhaps much of the 20th and definitely for the 21st century, it's hard to think about a specific place, urban or rural actually, that was not in the process of becoming hooked into these global circuits and whose fate was not tied in some critical way to other places in other countries. So the problem of studying global urbanism is at heart a problem of trying to identify why city making has become the dominant way of expressing global connections in the built environment. And it gives us a chance to think deliberately about the kinds of inequalities and imbalances that this sort of urbanism has fostered over time. So I'm going to try to be a good student and return to the questions that we were assigned, that we were supposed to consider. And one of them was, what are we doing well? So I'll start by saying that global urbanists are doing a remarkable job of tracing heterogeneous histories. And here I'm going to contradict the previous presentation a little. From tracing empire and decolonization in urban design, of course, Janet Abu-Lugod's work is, so important, but also more recent work by Jyoti Hosagrahar's framing of indigenous modernities, Brody Fisher's powerful work on poverty and inequality and through the lens of urban informality, Ananya Roy's work on racial banishment in cities fueled by global capital. We could also talk about the way that scholars have revealed the role of traveling experts, the homogenizing force of architectural training. And here I would name two up-and-coming scholars, Andrea Chastain, who connects urbanism in Santiago with French, US, and Brazilian actors, or Amanda Waterhouse, who looks at questions of development through architecture in Colombia. I could also point to scholars looking at the literal fuel that keeps these networks alive, what Lee Ho calls oil cities, or the port cities that I think, Cyrus, did you mention? I forget which of the two previous speakers mentioned, but that is obviously coming out of the work of Carola Hein, among others. We could also think about global investment. Dorothy Tang is doing amazing work tracing Chinese investments in Johannesburg and across Southeast Asian cities. And then there are scholars considering connections between urban placemaking and gender and sexual identity. And here I'm thinking of Natalie Olson's remarkable work on queer geographies and trans embodiment in urban space at the global scale. So if we're asked to speak about what we're doing well as global urbanists, I feel like there is so much amazing new work coming out, and it is an abundant and growing field. But part of the prompt was also to say, where do we need to do more work? And this is a tougher question to answer broadly, since I think the answer is inevitably personal. For starters, we might want to rethink the time frame that we use to explain the so-called modern city, Surely the modern city owes as much to the transformation of labor, the violent social reordering of slavery, the coolie trade, empire, to name three massive topics that directly impacted urban shape. The evolution of ideas about modernity indisputably come from deeper roots. And our understanding of cosmopolitanism, for instance, can only be enriched by understanding the work of Roshana Johnson, who talks about confined cosmopolitanism, or the work of scholars like Lupe Garcia, who shows us the 19th century roots of militarism and imperial rule in Caribbean urbanism. And of course, you can reach back farther than the 19th century, so I'm just choosing two examples. For me personally, bless you. For me personally, global urbanism is neither the study of places far away, nor is it the study of cities from a bird's eye point of view. And not to detract from that kind of work, we do need to zoom out. We do need the numbers and the data and the macro viewpoint, but that just isn't what catches me. And the study of global urbanism also, for me, isn't just a purely intellectual exercise or a wrestling with numbers. Rather, it helps me make sense of how my friends and family experience wealth and poverty around the world, and how generations before have done the same. It helps me understand how we ended up with such different vulnerabilities, especially in this age of rapid climate change. Global urbanism is a framework for understanding how cities change so rapidly that when my mother and father and older generations in my family go back to places that they used to call home, they find alien streets, houses, shops. Cities have turned into imaginary homelands, to borrow the language of Salman Rushdie. So for me, global urbanism is also embedded in every worker who sends savings home to reshape cities, a process Sarah Lopez describes in her work on remittance landscapes in Mexico. City life also goes on after the international experts leave. People continue to remake their houses, reuse imported materials, refashion their cities in what Christina Schwenkel calls the urban afterlife. And she does this wonderful work in Vietnam. This kind of global urbanism is not just a scaled down replica of New York or London or any other so-called global city. So to conclude then, global urbanism for me is at some core level non-scalable. And here I'm leaning on the theory of NSA. It is non-scalable and therefore must be studied city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, person by person. So I'll stop there.
Hi, everybody, and it's wonderful to be here, and it is also wonderful to go after those three very eloquent laying out of the field, which has laid out quite a bit of the groundwork, and I'm afraid I don't have such a eloquent, like Nancy, your thing was wonderful and eloquent. I don't think I have written up anything eloquent, but I think I want to in some ways begin with the provocation that Nancy ended with. And I love how all of it is fitting together. Just so, thank you for inviting me. I'm quite honored, and I will begin with a personal anecdote that actually talks about why I am here today in some way. So I am Devjani Bhattacharya, and I teach history at Drexel, and I'm the author of Empire and Ecology in the Bengal Delta, The Making of Calcutta. So I want to begin with this anecdote, which not because I like to tell personal stories, but because 4 or 5 years ago, something interesting happened. I sent off my manuscript, which in a way explores how the story of capital and property making in marshes in Calcutta, and how basically marshes, bogs, swamps were turned into profitable material, and it approached the question through an environmental and an economic logic to understand why reclamation became a mode of urbanization in cities across Asia or the Indian Ocean littoral. And the editor who liked my manuscript wrote back and asked me if I may add a thin global layer to my manuscript. And it's an interesting turn of a phrase. And so as Michael was presenting, I was thinking about his whole thing that he was saying. And I was like, what prevented me from adding that thin global layer to it? And I ended up not going with that press because I simply couldn't bring myself to add that thin global layer. And it was not that I was upset about why is New York or London or Boston or Chicago doesn't get asked to add the thin global layer, although I do think there's something interesting about it. But for me, And for anyone who's worked on South Asian history, and I think Sheetal will nod vigorously when I say this, for the longest time, at least from the 60s, 70s, people were writing the political histories of Calcutta, the economic history of Calcutta, the histories of sexual lives in Calcutta, gender history of people in Calcutta, and calling it the history of India, if not the history of the entire South Asian subcontinent. So anyone writing about Calcutta has the charge that we often want to lay a claim by looking at a very particular narrow archive to make a claim about the entire British Empire in some ways. And so definitely that I couldn't even begin to address that history about what that meant, to think about what are these places, what sort of nested history. And here I guess the question of global, like regional history, area studies history versus global history, urban history, and all these spaces we are looking at, but also to think interestingly about how do we think about the thin global layer and what this thin global layer meant. So one interpretation was that, okay, like a comparative history that would bring a place like New Orleans, which has the similar fate to something like Calcutta and Bombay, all threatened by climate change, to put it in a comparative perspective. And I think, Nancy, you think about that, like how do we think about these places which are facing similar historical moments at the same time and reacting differently. But then, and I think Cyrus, you were saying, how do we widen the topics and concepts that we work on when we think about global urban history? Although I think I really like your term, Nancy, the global urbanism. But the point I really wanted to think about is very carefully about the difference between thin and thick urban history, global urban history. And if we, along with widening, if we may drill down, and here I want to think carefully about what makes a city global, what cities enter the global arena and how do they enter. And the fact, and there I come to the second point about why I am here today. And I think there is something interesting has happened in the 6 years when I was going with my manuscript to various editors to today. And I call it the subterfuge way in which a city like Ho Chi Minh, Calcutta, Dhaka enter global histories is climate change, and the IPCC report has sort of given us a new language to think about these threatened cities, or what Amitav Ghosh in Great Derangement has said, oh, if we can find a solution for the littoral cities of the Indian Ocean, which is both densely populated, threatened by climate change, some of the few threatened cities, we will come up with a solution. So it is an interesting moment that then makes someone like me, who was writing a really narrow book about Calcutta, suddenly is part of a global conversation. And I think it is historically important about what allows certain cities to enter certain conversations and not, and which got me thinking about how do we think in terms of this drilling down, or this nested, if I may use the term, nested global cities, which are both about connections and networks, and those are very useful concepts. But how do we think about a place like Barbados? Like when I go to my late 18th century and early 19th century archive, what I see is Barbados, Calcutta, Manila, Canton, London, much more than a place like, for instance, Berlin, which would be considered today a global city. And how do we think of these places, which are deeply, very much a part of the empire? And I think either Michael or Cyrus, you were asking us to think through disconnections, not just what connects, but these moments when certain cities become disconnected. So the question is, how do we think about these various cities, which were both deeply part of the empire, almost central to the empire, but were at the frontiers, and I call it at the regulatory frontiers of the empire. And what do I mean when I say regulatory frontiers is these were sites of experiment, financial experiments with insurance, with municipal bonds, with various kinds of speculation, labor regime experiments. Sheetal, who will go after me, will talk about the making of the slum in some ways. These kinds of various kinds of experiments of spatial, capital and labor together, if we think about. So, and these were later globalized in multiple ways. So what if we begin to think about global urban history in ways that allows us to not let the global south, in some ways, I will use the term now, to enter either as case studies or simply as connections, but as spaces which sort of produce certain kinds of forms that we see now, for instance, replicated. How do we, for instance, talk about speculative urbanism when the way to talk about shell-owned housing in New York is only possible when we talk about slums in Bombay, slums in Calcutta, slums in Lagos. Like we can think in those terms. How do we say that story? Because how do we tell the story of these two getting made in together? And so that's the one thing. That's the second thing, like I thought, where this story of the thick and the thin global histories are important. And then I think the last point, and I think we were asked to think about provocations and to end with provocations. And here I want to, and coming out of my own work at the moment, is how do we in some ways think the global urban together with the planetary? And I think this is one of the new areas where perhaps work has to be done. And here I'm thinking in terms of planetary urbanization, which actually says there is no way we can write about cities without thinking the connections, not just the global hinterlands, but also the global countryside, which I think someone like Tariq Ali, Sven Beckert's work has allowed us to think about. But also, how do we think about the planetary in terms of the Anthropocene and the climate change and cities together? And this is, I think, an important conversation. I know Global Urban History Project is exploring, but this is the provocation with which I will end my comments. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me and for all these comments. I hope that I can follow up. I think a lot of things have been said that make a lot of what we're saying remarkably coherent, actually. So I'm Sheetal Chhabria. I'm an associate professor of history at Connecticut College. I'm actually not trained as an urban historian or an urbanist. I happen to write a book called Making the Modern Slum about colonial Bombay. But I'm primarily interested in the production of inequality and poverty. So I'm going to make three main points, but before I do, I'm just going to tell you two assumptions that I work with constantly. One is I take it as a fact that a city is not a container inside of which things happen, but an effect, a spatial effect. The question becomes, what is it an effect of, I think. And the second assumption is that the future or the current urbanization of the planet is happening in the global south. And this is not a belated urbanization, but represents a specific historical conjuncture. So the 3 points I want to make are one having to do with agriculture, the second having to do with the way we compare cities of the global south. And I don't like the term global south either, but I'm just going to use it to be quick, but how we compare cities of the global south with the north, and the fact that the city itself is a border. So first about agriculture, I'm going to say something a little ironic, I think. The way I see it is the logic of cityness or urbanization is not so different from improvements in agriculture. Both require intensifying capital and land use and managing labor's demands through the various techniques of violence or building compliance. The politics of each also have parallels. Here are two similarities. Rent control, for instance, in housing, is often resisted. It has been resisted since the 1930s, at least, by pointing out that landlords won't improve housing if rent control laws prevent them from making gains on investment. The same thing, it turns out, is said by agricultural landholders, who are often corporations, when asked to bear price controls for food, as was asked of them in the 1950s in India, while most of the population was on the brink of starvation. It's basically said agricultural landholders will say, well, if you control prices, we have no reason to invest then in land and increase productivity. Another parallel is our recent news has shown that the pandemic has left many more on the brink of hunger. India's hunger index is dismal and plummeting. And all the while, the Indian government has stores of food that could reach the moon and back. This is horrible and super important, but talk of food is like the housing question. It substitutes an effect for a cause. The real story is the widening inequality that is driving the inability to secure either shelter or food. There are three events, I think, in 2021 that made agriculture newsworthy again. One is the farmers' protests in India against the Modi government's plans to dismantle central markets and price controls. Basically, the Modi government opening up food markets to corporate takeover even more than ever. And as big box stores like Reliance and even Amazon push their way into Indian households, they displace small vendors and they seek to control the supply chain, giving a rather sick meaning to the phrase farm to table. against this, farmers have been protesting now for almost 10 months, I think, in Delhi. Another thing that put agriculture in the news was the UN People's Summit on Food, which was criticized by many people because of the large takeover by corporate agriculture into the agenda and into the meeting rooms. People called it corporate colonization. And the third piece of news that maybe Americans would be more familiar with is that supposedly Bill Gates became the largest farmer or agricultural landholder in the US, owning 242,000 acres, purportedly to have his investments be carbon neutral, but also indicating the way in which land ownership is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, leading to a monopolistic role in driving food systems. This is perhaps a third similarity between agriculture and urbanization. Both housing and farmland are increasingly owned by corporate landlords. In the US, many very large farms claim to be family farms, but in fact, they are family corporations. And more renters pay rent to corporate landlords rather than individual landlords. Each of these three news stories reveals something very important about the role of agriculture in our current moment in the history of capitalism, which is that from the point of view of those who seek to accumulate capital, agriculture has not and perhaps will never disappear or be replaced by the city. Agriculture was and is in fact seen as a site of immense opportunity for accumulation, food being used as a way of controlling and subduing and even threatening laboring populations. Hence the immense drive by corporate and government allies into capturing agriculture. The Bill Gates story, I think, is particularly poignant because if you ask undergraduates what do they think of when they think of a city, they often think of technology and things like that, right? And Bill Gates, of course, is the tech guy. So my second point is about the comparative development of cities of the Global South. Whatever appears different about cities of the Global South versus North has much more to do with the way deep democracy has been thwarted or conscripted into the service of modernization and national wealth building than with the belatedness of capitalist development. In the 19th century, many cities across the world had similar problems, such as surplus labor, a crowding of surplus labor, disease outbreaks, irregular spatial patterns, and control. It was only in the late 19th century, with the very sustained efforts of what we call housemanization or social welfare programs upon the Great Depression, like New Deal era federal housing assurances, public housing, minimum wage, Medicare, Medicaid, public schools, et cetera, that cities of the global North deviated from the global South. Each represents, in the first case, the violence on which capitalist development depends, but erases from its own history. And in the second, the partial success of immense labor mobilization to make the government work on behalf of the majority of the people. In Indian cities, you see much more of the former, that is housemanization, than the latter. It is from where techniques and apparatuses of government come to the rest of the world, that is from the global South to the North, how to manage a surplus population, how to sedentarize mobility, how to enhance the mobility of some objects like capital, finance, and cheap labor, while keeping stuck in place other objects, surplus population, working classes, and capital investments. It is from those cities of the global South that North Atlantic rulers and governments learn how low they can go, how much suffering can a people take. It is only organized action against that race to the bottom that prevents places of the global North from falling too. One of the reasons I resist the term globalization or global in my own work sometimes is because I learned from my late advisor, Adam McEwen, that he has this article where he said that that people were actually more mobile before the 1930s than now. I think the true story of globalization is how much stuck in place people have really become. And globalization is really an era of building more borders. Speaking of borders, this brings me to my third and final point. I think of the city itself as a border, not as in the lines that border a city, but as in the city as an endpoint or goal of modernization. I really like what Nancy said about the way in which people aspire to claim urbanity or urbanness as a way to distinguish themselves. The city helps organize gradations of substantive citizenship in countries where deindustrialization or non-industrialization drive wages down by distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate housing, legitimate and illegitimate land use, and legitimate and illegitimate labor in ways that make what we call informality not a past of formalized market life, but its future, ready to appear whenever deregulations give exploiters opportunities to pay less than a living wage or use labor against each other, or turn a contractual labor market into a gig economy, and so on. In sum, I'll just close with this. What studying global cities for me teaches us, and by that phrase, we presumably simply mean the West versus the rest, is that processes of immiseration and wealth creation are not so different after all from what happens anywhere else. Meaning, if you study inequality and you study the way in which capitalism drives that inequality and the city as an effect of it, you'll find that there are probably a lot more similarities than there are differences. Okay, I'll just end there.
All right. Oops. Great. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Well, good afternoon. Greetings from the West Coast, specifically Southern California. Thank you for coming and staying. I really enjoyed listening to all of these talks before me. And I guess I'm sad to go last, but here we are. All right, great. So I'm really happy to be part of this already stirring conversation about the state of the global city. I was struck but not surprised by the slides showing the distribution of the places where the conversation about what it means to be global and urban is happening. But I was also really struck in general, but specifically by one of the early talks about, entering the conversation of what it means to be part of a global city or global urbanism. So I'm a historian of West African cities, and my work focuses specifically on the histories of Lagos, Nigeria. I'm an assistant professor of history at UC Riverside, and I've published on topics including map making using historical GIS, urban fieldwork, and historical narratives to rethink indigenous and colonial histories in a place like Lagos. And my forthcoming book, Imagine Lagos, is a spatial and cartographic history of that city. Now, my research, like many who study cities like myself, is rooted in really thinking with the contemporary city, using the city itself, this urban fabric as evidence, and tracing the roots of its urban form and the process of urbanization back at least to the 19th century. This evening, I will offer some brief thoughts on the states of the global city from the perspective of the West African coast, where some of the fastest growing cities in the world are to be found. I'll make 3 specific remarks and try to make them quickly and move on. So in thinking about this idea of the global city, recently I've been thinking much more about what makes cities like Lagos, Accra, Dakar, and others global in a meaningful way, in a contemporary and even historical sense. So I write about Lagos, a dense urban agglomeration that hugs part of the coastline of West Africa and is home to many, many millions of people. Our cities in West Africa are interconnected with each other and across the world, economically, politically, and in other ways. But we already know that these connections are not even across time and space, especially in terms of the way we enter these conversations. Lagos, like the Lagosians that live there, is grappling with a variety of problems. It celebrates its present expansion, and it tries to cement its global reach, say through projects like Eco-Atlantic, which is not without controversy. And of course, looking towards a future in which tech and filmmaking continue to play a major role, economically, socially, and culturally. So while at the same time, the citizens who live there are grappling with its past as an outpost of British Empire, as a thriving slave port in the 19th and 18th centuries, and as a coastal enclave that's far from the bigger cities of the time in the Yoruba interior, in what is now Nigeria. So I think for the places that I study and that I'm interested in, even the phrase global city prompts is an immediate provocation. Yes, we do have these large heterogeneous spaces all over Africa. And yes, urbanization has had dramatic effects on the climate, landscape, culture, peoples, and economy. But what kinds of, or how do we characterize the historical depth of these cities and people's spatial practices? Let's say indigenous Yoruba in a place like Lagos. If a place like Lagos has global reach, how much of that is from a position where the initiative and ideas come from the people in the city? And how do we understand the history of these cities when what we think about them is rooted in the logic of colonialism, imperialism, of what they lack? If we begin only in the 20th century, these are the kinds of histories that we think about. And we think about the effects of cities on our populations when we think about the past. So how can we more clearly historicize cityness, to quote a historian, in a place like Lagos, rather than see a kind of reactionary urbanism in the ways that we respond to the ways people are thinking about wealth inequities, poor infrastructure, police brutality, and other crises that punctuate these cities? The way we write about these cities often make us think that they are urban not by action and intention, but often in their reaction to the adverse circumstances that drives migration from rural to urban areas and from Lagos into the wider world, where people find themselves be economic and other migrants. So secondly, on the state of these cities, what can we do to make these cities in Africa livable and not just leavable, right? Responses to, or lack thereof, to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic have shown how acutely and seemingly insurmountable these problems are for people who live in Lagos. If we are indeed part of a globalized economy, our role in it has been exploited and extractive in terms of human and other resources. And there's a long history of this stretching even beyond colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. So, but when historians think about places like Lagos, they've imagined them in the long and short term. But most of these understandings, as Michael showed earlier, when we think about what is globally urban, we still leave Africa outside of this picture, right? Our contributions, except maybe when we think about cities in the very north, maybe like Cairo, and maybe in its southern tip in places like Johannesburg. But my question would be, what of Kinshasa, Accra, Nairobi? We've already heard of the ways these cities are connected to others, right? The conversations about these cities in the contemporary and historical sense falls too heavily on the size of problems, too poor, too crowded, too little of everything except the people. And of course, some have leveraged this idea to think about, informal economies and the idea of people as infrastructure. So one historian writing on Mozambique, for instance, points to an important move for historians of Africa and thinking globally, that we should move from what is aspirational to what is actually happening on the ground. Think about local initiatives and how this frames the broader understanding of the world. We should move, quote, from the drafting table to the sites, to the streets, from the officials to the actual tenants and inhabitants of these places as we think about them. The ways that people live in Lagos is more than about scarcity, lack of access to food, shelter, to work, or other formalized inclusive economies. And even these edges are now even more than edges of the city, and they're more than margins. And in fact, the ideas and the ways that people respond to problems in the city is moving closer to defining what the whole city means. So scholars of Lagos and cities like it have, of course, delved into these questions of informal economies, the promise and pitfalls of urban planning, and the familiar ideas of how people exist in these spaces. I will end in terms of something optimistic in thinking about the state of the field and thinking about cities like Lagos, and especially our relationship to the world. I think that considering the state of the field is actually what leaves room for optimism in thinking about our role in global urbanism, or even a reactionary urbanism, as I've said earlier. The historiography of these cities has come a long way from thinking about the dualities of what it means to be a colonial city, or only the negative impacts of urbanization, to actually more exciting, nuanced, and really interesting takes on people and place in the global and local context. To quote one scholar, we have often thought about African cities, especially in the ways that people have lived in what they call slums, especially south of the Sahara, in terms of either as case studies of unmitigated crises or, quote, as arenas of dormant potentialities. I'm happy to note that scholars are moving beyond this, and I see a couple of them on this call. People like Akima Bogunje, who in the 60s and 70s were really at the vanguard of this research with his own work on Nigerian cities, was able to set a new agenda for thinking historically about urban life, space, and people together. And when it comes to the new directions that intellectuals in the cities are taking, this is where, again, the optimism lies. In universities in Lagos and all over Nigeria, where students, historians, and urban planners like Tybert Lawenson, Ayodele Olukoju, and others pursue research agendas that reflect an understanding and resonance of the people in the city and how we exist in this world as a whole. Scholars like Abosede George and emerging scholars like Halimat Somerton, and even new initiatives to think about archiving our past and our present are happening in these cities. And new institutions like the Lagos Studies Association, led by Sahid Aderinto, center intellectual production in these cities as a way to face the world rather than looking at a place like Lagos from, let's say, New York or Boston, other places. So more than ever, scholars are taking control of these narratives. They're beginning conversations and they're even ending them because they take seriously the priorities of people who live there. So to conclude, I'll end with a question from a recent public lecture from a Lagos historian, where he asked, which Lagos and whose history? I offer this to highlight that even if we think of the ways that Lagos and other places are or are not global cities, there are still many pressing historical and local questions to address to those that live there today. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody. This we might have set a record for academics. I think everybody kept within the 10 minutes that they were supposed to do. So we have plenty of time for questions. And please, those of you in attendance, begin to shape and think about your questions in the Q&A. I want to say something. I mean, I often think when I teach that I hope that my students are more confused when they leave class than when they enter, and I feel like I'm somewhat more confused in a good and productive way. And while we were talking, I kept thinking about my son, who grew up in Philadelphia and went to school in a city, St. Louis, and he now finds himself living in a town of 7,000 people in Michigan. And I don't think he'd mind me saying this, he's pretty miserable. And he constantly compares his life to New York and London, and particularly to Philadelphia. But I also think, to borrow the phrase, that there's a thin global layer over this town of 7,000 people, in terms of people, in terms of production, in terms of the flow of capital, in terms of the way people experience their lives. And one of the things that I imagined that would happen didn't happen, and that is no place was excluded in our conversation. Nothing, in a sense, right? And I'm just, I would open this up as a question. Is there something that isn't a global city? Like, and is there something meaningful about the word city or urbanism? We didn't use the word scale at all, which dates me back to the 1970s when that was an right? When that was an important point. We sort of thought a little bit about circuits, right? But an older concept from kind of studying global cities. So I'm just starting us off. I'm curious about the negative. In other words, what wouldn't be a global city, or are there only people interacting in kind of global networks within many spaces? I mean, Nancy kind of sort of talked about that lived lives. So while people form their questions, I'll throw that out there for us to think about.
Did you want us to respond, Brian, or do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, if you're provoked to, yeah, and then we'll wait, for people to kind of continue to ask questions.
Okay, I can just start us off by saying a couple of things, which is, so Fred Cooper wrote an article, "What is the concept of globalization good for?" And in it, he argued that in any moment in historical time, there are people included in circuits and flows, and there are some people left out. And the question for the historian becomes, what are the processes and things or events or structures that allow some people to be included and some people to be left out? So I don't think, so that's one thing. Eric Wolf said a long time ago that nobody was untouched by modern transformations, that there's no place in the world that's isolated. There are, of course, people that are more touched and more untouched, but no place is isolated. So for me, I feel like those questions are pretty settled. However, I do kind of want us to think about, when we do research on a city, or when we whatever it is that we do as academics, in whose service are we doing it? For whom does it matter, the answers we come up with? Because I suspect that if you go to the poor of a city or the rich of a city, you'd get very different research agendas from them, right? And so I think it is worth asking, in whose service are we doing any research? What is the problem that we are trying to figure out? One of the frustrations I have, I think, with urban studies or urban history or whatever, things that assume urbanism in advance, is cities themselves are not that interesting. I mean, a city is a place. It's, if you've moved around a lot, you go to one place, you go to another, you're like, okay, I get it. These are different places. Sure, a town with 7,000 people is less interesting than others, but I think it's important to move past the city and say, okay, what is the topic about which we want to write a city's history anyway? So I'll stop there.
I can quickly jump in, and I think like while we wait for questions, one of the things, like what place is not touched for me, I think there's a historiographic way also to approach the question. And like here I'm thinking through, I think what Cyrus was asking us to pay attention to in the beginning is like, what are the moments like certain cities enter the conversations? And here perhaps it is often, and like I don't want to give one answer, but it is the mobility of capital that envelops certain spaces. And always with the mobility of capital comes various infrastructures of governance and tools of governance, both organization of space and people. However we may want to look at it, segregation, necropolitics, whatever, like we want to. And what is that then brings? And what comes in and what comes out at what point and which cities. I think these historiographies have to be marked if we really want to think through, is there a historiography that is about global urbanism or global urban history? It is these frames that actually allow certain things to enter and certain things to kind of wane out in some ways out of these conversations.
Nicole asked two questions. We'll start with the first one, and she kind of gave us a few, but how about we can play a rapid fire. Everybody, what's a key book that someone should be reading on the 21st century global history? So everybody want to sort of throw out one book or one piece that someone could build a syllabus from.
I think, well, maybe to mention, I think the sort of to-go book historiographically at this point is probably Sebastian Conrad's What is Global History? It's as good a starting point as any for the discussion of the field, I think, and it's reasonably recent.
This seems like a trick question in a way.
It's a real question.
I think that there are so many things, and I think also Nancy mentioned a ton of really exciting books. I mean, two I would highlight definitely are Beyond the Walled City, by Guadalupe Garcia, who writes about Havana. Really, I think Caribbean urbanism is really fascinating in the ways that people are writing about it now. And also Rashona Johnson's book on New Orleans, especially in her formulation of confined cosmopolitanism, and how she's rethinking empire, confinement, people being commodified, all kinds of things in New Orleans.
Sheetal, you want to throw out a book?
Sure. I mean, I hesitate to do this because it's, there's so many good books, but I really like Sai Balakrishnan's Shareholder Cities, which is about corridor cities and the way in which new investments in agriculture are producing new infrastructure projects that connect cities to countrysides.
So Johnny, you want to throw one out, and then we'll go back to Nancy and there, and then follow up with a question for Nancy.
This is again, I would say, a very, very tough one. I don't know like where to begin and I don't want to sound strange, but I do think in some ways, like for 21st century historian, a book about global city, I would say Sheetal's book, The Making of the Slum, would be in some ways for me very methodologically interesting. Everybody else's, but that's a book I've read very closely and engaged with.
Very sweet of you, Johnny. I don't think that qualifies since I'm here. You have to name another book.
So
well, can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I just want to say everyone should read Mike Davis. When I was in graduate school, we were not supposed to read Mike Davis, but luckily
now. Do you mean City
of
Slums or City of Quartz? I mean, for me, it was City of Quartz.
Yep, and Planet of Slums and Late Between, all of them. I think if you even go back to Prisoners of the American Dream, great book. Yeah.
I like the shout out to Mike Davis. So Nancy, a book, and then Nicole wanted you to talk a little bit more about it's really kind of, I mean, it was a really eloquent line that you said that global history must be studied city by city, neighborhood by neighbor, person by person. And so maybe to talk a little bit more about that idea and maybe that methodology.
Sure. So I won't name one book, although I feel like I named a bunch in the book. And I don't know if you noticed, but I named all women because women also know history. So anyway, so I think that it's important to read broadly and to read scholars that don't have name recognition and to read junior scholars and to really kind of stretch. I will say one person who's had a lot of influence on the way I think about cities is Aberdeen Kusno, who, it's funny because actually some of the most influential scholars on the way I think about urban history are not urban historians. So I'm not sure what that says, but in any case, I think that, my general advice is to read broadly and to read from different scales. And actually I'm looking at the attendee list for the first time and realizing some of the greatest hits are actually people sitting here in this room right now. So I would urge you to check out the participant list too. Regarding the question about what I mean by studying city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, I think there's a tendency to, when you start talking about global cities or when you start talking about global urbanism, to start talking about entire cities in relationship to each other. So New York did this, Mumbai did that, London did this, and it's very strange actually. And then even more strange is that the city is thought to be some sort of cohesive whole. And so what I mean when I say that global history has to be studied at different scales, and in particular to take seriously those scales, is to account for the way that cities are no more than, as Sheetal said so beautifully, the effect of the actions of all the people who participate in making the city. And the porousness of the boundaries of the city into the so-called non-city spaces tells you just how created and how flexible and how contingent that idea of urbanism is. So that's all I meant when I said that, really questioning the idea of scalability. Oh, and Brian, I did use the word scale, but I used it embedded in the word non-scalability. So maybe that doesn't count.
Fair enough. Matthew, I think Sheetal talked about this really kind of blew my mind. You brought up the issue about people being less mobile since the 1930s, which I'm still trying to, it actually makes sense to me. And then sort of talked about borders as a kind of modern project, which is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. I'm working on a book about the history of the public bathroom. And so it's really kind of a book about borders and boundaries. But so the question is, you mentioned that borders have become more definitive and restrictive in our modern age. So perhaps people today can actually move less than before, yet clearly ideas and goods are moving globally at a faster pace than ever. And much of that happens through global cities. So I'm not sure how to formulate a question, but this person's sort of asking a paradox that I think exists in the literature itself, right? About the kind of conception of increased scale of mobility of capital and goods against this idea of more restriction. And I'm curious if Sheetal, you can take that first, but if anyone else wants to sort of think about this paradox and if it helps us imagine the topic today.
So I think it was Foucault that said urbanism is about, or sort of the management of space is about controlling good circulation versus bad. And the question to ask is, what are the things that move and what are the things that don't move? And I think especially, I've been reading, by the way, People's Green New Deal by Max Isle. And it's a critique of the American Green New Deal project. And it has really opened my eyes. And as we continue through this climate crisis, which is only going to get worse, the fact is that more and more people are going to be left out, and more and more borders are going to be built, whether they're legal borders, literal walls, all sorts of boundaries to keep climate refugees out. So that is really the game in town, I think. So I don't think things are I mean, stuff might be more mobile. Biden recently just said he's going to work on supply chain issues, and he scolded corporations over this because their stuff needs to move before the holidays, right? But it's very important to ask what's moving and what isn't.
Anyone else want to think about this question?
Yeah, if I may just say a word, I don't think that this is a contradiction at all, right? Because the movement of some are always conditioned on the non-movement or lesser movement of others. These are not two separate sort of here or there sort of phenomena. They're really two sides of the exactly same coin. One can, you know, basically show this with migration, who can, who cannot. One can show it with the movement of, you know, capital, etc., etc. And I think this is something that, you know, global historians more generally have really started to pay much more attention to in the last maybe 5, maybe a little bit more years. And this is what I meant when I, you know, when I said that we need to, I think, look at disconnections and hierarchies also between cities more than before. I think Nancy made a very good point, if I understood you correctly, Nancy, namely that the study of inequality within particular cities, that's definitely something that has been done a lot. That's totally right. The question would be how to, you know, think about things comparatively, right? Without starting to treat cities like containers, which I think all of you have, you know, mentioned is a real problem, and I totally agree.
Okay, 2 more, a couple questions from the chat. So UTM, which I'm not totally sure what that is, but it's a good question, asks, do factors of social mobility reinforce social classes? Is this still seen in African and Indian societies, let alone in Western concepts like the US, between rural and urbanized ones? So how much is issues of mobility frame our understanding of a global city, and does that kind of understanding change with geography, by region, by place?
Well, just one sentence. I think I think in different cases and countries, social class relies on different factors. In some, education is really, really central. In others, it may have more to do with cultural capital or economic capital. So I think it's really hard to make a generalization.
Thanks, Cyrus. All right, Eric Rhodes, who I know is asking a question, and the first one, he wants to know good PhD programs to study global history that are English speaking. Any ideas for him on that one?
So the advice I would give on this one, and it's nice to see you virtually. The advice I give, and this is sort of generic advice, so you're not going to be that happy, but would be to find the scholars that you most admire and then find what institutions they work in, because ultimately they're the people who are going to guide your project. I guess I would say off Zoom, I'd be delighted to have a more specific conversation with you.
All right. Anyone else? I mean, just in some ways, is there a place where the study of global cities is taking place that might be surprising. Like, for instance, some of the best work on food studies of the US is happening at Erfurt University in Germany. Like, is there a kind of place that we might not think of?
I'll just say, I think the geography departments at Rutgers and Berkeley are both especially good. Those would be good places, yeah.
So thank you. So Eric follows up and said, can the panelists speak about the difference between global, transnational, international, and other border crossing histories? So is there, and he wants to know if you think that US historians are less open than scholars elsewhere to kind of global approaches.
I can take that, and I will link it up with a question that came before, I think by Emily, about thinking through hubs, whether hubs and global. And I think this also relates back to an earlier question also on borders. I think, Bryant, you were asking, are we moving more or less? It is very interesting when we say global, we often think of hubs and ports. And what do hubs and ports actually signify? Spaces of transit, of forced and not forced mobilities in some ways. And I think it is important to think through in some ways. Yes, people were moving, and I think I like what both Sheetal and Cyrus, you both said, but I think they're also not a contradiction in some ways. So much of the mobility in the 19th century was forced. And if we look at all these containers that are moving goods, it's also, there is so much of near indentured labor that's moving these containers around in the ship. So there is a floating population of Philippines, Bangladeshis, especially South and Southeast Asian people moving these containers around, who spent months on the ship. So it's very interesting, but they also make our cities in some ways, if you want to think through containerization. But coming to the question also of the border crossing, I do think US historians are in some ways opening up. I get a little uncomfortable with transnational or international, because as a historian of colonialism, it feels also imperial, because imperial history was about following colonial officials around. Transnational histories often end up following development brokers, thinkers, those kinds of people around. But the question is, how do we, and I think this is what I think Nancy's charge to us is today, how do we write global histories neighborhood by neighborhood? How do we write nested histories that actually think through the stories from the vernacular right up to the top, which would be transnational, but would actually not be about English speaking crowd of people moving through Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I'll just say those few words.
Anybody else want to comment on this notion of, in some ways, nomenclature, right? Transnational, international, global. All right, we have another question. We don't have to belabor questions we don't want to answer. Carl Nightingale, hi Carl, is glad that this conversation on theory and urban historians has started. And he writes, Nancy, can you help me square the idea that everything has to be thought about on multiple scales and the term non-scalability? Cyrus, you have talked a lot about the interaction of multi-scalar phenomenon. What is left of things that happen on the scale of the city? For all, he asks, should we celebrate its dissolution as some fear, I think that it being the city, or does connecting global and city actually enhance the importance of spaces defined by cityness? So Nancy, do you want to start, then Cyrus, and then others, do you want to jump in, please?
Yeah, so hi, Carl. So I'll start by saying, really great and as usual, rigorous question. I think if we think about scales across time and in different layers, as opposed to thinking we're going to do a project that is at this scale, that is actually quite revealing. So what I mean by that is, for instance, at what instances should we talk about housing or lack of housing at the scale of the city? Well, we should talk about at that scale when we're considering big shifts in policy or changes in the sort of budget that the municipal government is providing, let's say. At what points should we think about the level of the neighborhood? When, so there are different moments that you can consider these scales. And I think predetermining the scale at the level of the city is the problem, rather than saying that the level of the city is useless. What I'm saying is that the predetermination of that level is the problem. In terms of the theory, I think I mentioned it, but I was referring to the work of Anna Singh. I'll put it in the chat so you can just have the full citation.
Cyrus, do you want to talk about that next part?
Yes, and I think I should probably pick up. I think this was Sheetal who talked about, this, because it's a really good way. I didn't in my book, the Middle East and the making of the modern world. I didn't mention this before. Sheetal, I think it was you who talked about cities as effects, and when you think about it this way, then I think the sort of concept I tried to introduce in the book, which is Trans-Spatialization, namely the way in which different scales, of phenomena basically create and recreate, form and reform each other, particularly, I think, at the greater speed than before in the modern period. That sort of, makes sense. And I think what's really interesting about cities, some more than others perhaps, is precisely how, for instance, particular urban and national, or particular national and global phenomena actually start to interact and form each other in new ways, right? So that's basically part of what I try to do in this book. And if that's what you're doing, then I actually do think that in the end, and perhaps this is what Carl, meant when he actually put the city in quotation marks, I actually don't think that there is something that is only and exclusively urban, right? That we can really, neither actors, nor structures, nor processes, nor anything else that we can say, this is really only urban. It is not also in some way national or global, etc. But I don't think that this is a problem. I think that it just makes us think about the different reasons why this may be the case, and the different ways in which this, as Sheetal put it, basically manifests different effects of various processes that we're interested in. So I don't think we can bury down and get to a bedrock where it is just the city and nothing else. Yeah.
Hi, Carl.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Hi, Carl. I'm trying to still think, lovely to see you here. Let's think of the question, like the dissolution. And it is hard to think actually of the dissolution of the city from my vantage point, where I think in India, all our policies are being driven by the fact that we are going to be urbanizing. And I think Ademide was talking about the same thing. Is the fastest urbanizing places are cities in Africa, cities in Asia. So city is not dissolution. In fact, I think Sheetal made this interesting connection of how to think about city and agriculture together. And the question is how the city is actually encroaching upon the agrarian, upon the peri-urban. So the whole conversation, I think, at least from my vantage point in South Asia or India, it is about the urban actually expanding into spaces that are not urban. And it's not just about cities building spaces, it's about various forms in some ways. And I think what Cyrus, you're saying, like various forms actually encroaching, forms of finances, forms of living life, infrastructures, various kinds of being at the expense, where we feel the need to do away with certain forms within the rural So that's I don't know if I answered your question, Carl, but that's something that's an interesting thing. But of course, if you say there is a fear, there's an interesting kind of dilemma perhaps we need to think through, with the fear of the cities becoming not a interesting concept at the very moment that some of the most populated parts of the world are fast urbanizing. It's an interesting dilemma to think through, I think.
Day, do you want to tackle that question?
Sure. I think that this is part of what is challenging in thinking globally, thinking about global urbanism. When I hear about these stark divides between rural and urban or anything in between, if we think historically for West Africa, people who built cities, let's say in Ibadan, in the interior of, let's say, the Bight of Benin, they didn't always think of agriculture as distinct from being urban in that sense. So when we sort of think more broadly and try to think about cityness or urbanism in a global scale using city models that come from the West, it becomes very difficult to be part of a conversation about things like this. I mean, Sheetal mentioned, sometimes cities themselves are not very interesting. And I found that really provocative, especially when we think about, let's say, 19th century Africa. People didn't imagine cities, at least from the sources we have, as separate from other places or places that are disconnected. These are 20th century, at least, phenomena in West Africa, where we see these stark movement from places that have no resources to places that have the most resources. Then you have this rapid urbanization where we have 50% of Nigerians living in cities, and they're young, and they're dealing with all these issues. So I think this is part of what, as I said, makes it difficult to have these conversations broadly across time and space. This idea of cityness, I don't think is settled, and what it means, what it looks like, and what kinds of effects are produced in different places. And this has been very challenging in my part of the world to write about before the 20th century, I would say.
Carl just adds an addendum to his question, and he writes, "My question has to do with the fear among urban historians that globalizing the subject will diminish the importance of the subject to which they've devoted their careers." So I want to switch gears, and my very dear friend Minju Bae writes a question where she says, "I'm struck by the conversation about borders and mobility in contrast to the politics of immigrants, and refugees." And so she asks provocatively, she puts in quotes, "Is global history possibly summarized by histories of empire?" Is that, and well, go ahead, Cyrus, you're shaking your head, so go ahead.
I think it's a really important part, but you can't summarize it to this because there are systemic effects that go way beyond what each and every empire can do on their own, right? And there is, some really good literature on this. Like, for instance, Thomas Martin, I think Thompson wrote an article about this like 4 or 5 years ago. Where they think about empire and globalization together, and the two of them go hand in hand, and they overlap, but they are not reducible to each other for all sorts of different reasons. I'll just say that.
Sheetal, do you want to think about this question?
I'm still thinking about it, so I'm not sure what to say, to be honest.
Can I maybe add one thing?
Yeah, please.
It depends also very much. So, okay, there's so much to be said about this, right? So it also depends very much which empire to talk about, right? So I think it's probably correct to say that in the modern period, we have had only 2 empires, the British one, and then more or less after World War II, the US one, that really have had a some sort of worldwide systemic, presence, right? And so if you would actually think about the two things as being together, then you will probably need to think in terms of what these empires did and also with whom they worked, because their intermediaries are really, really critical for how they actually work things out, right? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
The question really does also sort of kind of bring us back to notions of borders, right? And I think so often urban historians look at the container from inside of it, but the kind of idea of looking at the container from outside of it is another way I think we can think about it. Does anyone else want to play around with this idea?
Actually, I don't know how you feel about this, but I would love to hear a little bit more from Minju about exactly what you were thinking as you posed that question. By the way, I loved your session last time.
Minji, do you want to elaborate? Minju writes, I can try.
Can people unmute and actually join us, or is that not allowed?
I think that's like the anti-webinar, the pretty awful thing about the webinar. But it saves, well, we don't need to have a conversation about what works and what doesn't work in Zoom. Actually, do we want to let Minju sort of think about this until we put her on the spot? So we have another question, and maybe we can move on and come back to that. Is that all right? You all were so wonderfully punctual that we kind of have some space here. So Matthew asks, I'd like to ask about how the global mental scope results in better scholarship, which I believe it can do. For example, understanding Tokyo could potentially help one to better understand New York and vice versa. Yet there's also a danger of making superficial comparisons or drawing misleading conclusions when using one place to help comprehend another. What are your thoughts about this? And I'm kind of prompted by this one time, listening to at a panel of an urban history conference when someone said, well, it can only be urban if it has 3 countries or 3 places, right? And so that so much of early urban history kind of came out of that comparative history moment. And I think Matthew's asking us to think about these comparative models and how we deploy them.
I guess I just want to ask a follow-up question to that, which is, what concretely do we mean when we say we comprehend a place, when we understand a place? What do we understand?
I think it's a real right. And then this sort of is part of Nancy's answer to the place by place, person by person idea.
I think also one can add to that question, which says in some ways, like, I think it is interesting to what Matthew Hines is saying, just think through the kind of urban forms that emerge in some ways and how they get vernacularized or spatialized in different places. So to think in terms of, for instance, like following Nancy's work on homelessness, like there is homelessness in Calcutta where I grew up, and there is homelessness in Philadelphia where I currently live, but they have very different nested history. So I cannot at all write a comparative history of homelessness with Calcutta. Like I could write a diverging history of Calcutta and Philadelphia and homelessness, because in Calcutta, homelessness is the urban poor, urban working poor for whom the government has not provided housing. Their salaries just cannot allow them to build housing. So they are, and whereas Philadelphia is a different history, which would have to begin from medicalization of mental health care and various kinds of things. So the question is, what are we comparing? And that could be productive, not necessarily like it's a bad comparison, but it could talk about, allow us to understand how urban governance function in these 2 places.
It does seem that so much, often what you're doing is comparing the state, right? When you're doing comparative history. Does anyone else want to kind of riff on the comparative angle? And Minju now has had more time to kind of formulate her question. And so Minju, right, if we want to go back to, I don't want to cut anyone off if they want to sort of think aloud about comparative global history.
Can I jump in for 2 seconds and just make a random observation, which is that it's interesting, like, as historians, we're very careful about comparison. And, what you said about homelessness, right on, of course you can't do that, right? So my instinct is to be like, of course. But then you go into the world of policy and suddenly everyone's like, give me an idea. I don't care what country you're from or what city you're from. Give me an idea that worked and let me see how I can twist it and apply it in a way that'll help me. I think this is a really interesting divide, disciplinary divide, or I don't know what to call it, ways of approaching the city. And I don't really have a comment about it other than to just observe that it exists.
That's fascinating. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
Can I just jump in
course.
here? So basically, I think, Nancy, you're totally right. And I think what happens, what you describe, is a development where something that starts as a comparison actually turns into a linkage, right? Because then, let's say, municipal workers in two cities who have, very, very generically speaking, the same issue, start to think with each other's models to solve the same issue, although it has very, very different roots, right? So and this, of course, then plays to the question of what the relationship is for a historian between thinking in terms of comparisons and thinking about linkages, right? But there's a huge methodological literature about that. To me, still, like, one of the most interesting, people writing, for instance, about municipalities and how they actually interacted is Pierre-Yves Saunier, right? It's just like a really interesting way, I think, about talking about a very particular register or theme of connectedness.
Thanks, Cyrus. All right, so let me, and I think we can end on this question. Minju sort of clarifies, she writes, in some ways, the global city provokes us to think about the metropole as well as those in colonized spaces. Migrants often migrate in relation to a border or destabilization or intervention or race war. Another way to think about another way that I'm thinking about it is finance capital as a stage of imperialism. I'm not sure. I'm glad to think with you all about it. Does that open the question up for some of you to kind of what she's trying to get at?
I can take it. And what I find very provocative about your question and in my current work, which is not necessarily about cities, I have taken on that, like, how do we think about these spaces together? How do we think about a space that we may call a financial wasteland? I was thinking when you were talking about your son's city, Bryant, what we may think about as a financial wasteland is central to the operations of finance capital or over a longer period. How do we think about, that's something I was trying to think about also, like, how do we think about Barbados both as a deeply global city, but global precisely because it is at the or a place like Calcutta, precisely because it is at a regulatory margin where you can experiment with things, or what I think Sheetal said very beautifully, the race to the bottom that can happen in certain places that allows the metropole to be the metropole in a certain way. So in a way, I actually think the provocation you have, Minju, that are they imperial? Perhaps I won't say the histories of empire and global urban history are the same, but I think there is an interesting provocation here in your question is, how do we think, what happens when we think metropole and colonized urban spaces together? How does that reframe what we are saying about just global history per se, or imperial histories?
Particularly in British, basically in the history of the British Empire, right? British imperial history, already for like 20 years, basically what you're saying here has been not done necessarily, I think, for cities, but more generally for the way in which people are imagining and framing the empire, namely not as a hub with spokes, but as a web, right? There are some problems with this too, which is that it becomes a little bit too everybody everywhere is like more or less the same thing, and this is a problem. But I think there are really models to think with, right? For instance, coming from that particular historiography. I also think that, this is a really, a really excellent, example that shows us how important it is to actually define what we mean when we say global in each and every case, because we really do mean different things. Yeah. And so here, I think it may make a lot of sense to think about it as basically something that's very close to imperial, though it may have inter-imperial sort of, dimensions as well, looking at the relationships with, people in other empires. So not only people from, British African colonies went to Birmingham and London and the other way around. Sometimes people from French colonies would do so as well, right? So I think it's a really good example for me that shows, again, to recap, how important it is to actually define in each and every instance of each and every study what exactly we mean when we say global, because I really think we mean a lot of different things.
Well, it's Friday night. Maybe we're done. But I really wanted to thank everyone. I wanted to thank all of you who came and again spent part of your Friday night with us, and to thank Cyrus, Michael, Nancy, Debjani, Chital, Ademi, Dave, all of you for participating. And I wanted to thank the Urban History Association for setting this up, and thank Heather for imagining this. And I'm sorry that you can't be here with us. And just to remind you for a moment that this event is part of the Urban History Month, which is an ongoing project of the Urban History Association. And to suggest, if you're not a member of the UHA, that you should consider joining today. And I think in the chat, there should be a link to the UHA website, which will tell you, there it is, the other events that are coming up. So again, thanks everybody for coming. And I hope this is the start of a great weekend, and that we can continue this conversation somewhere down the line. All right, good night.